Hi. The Bible is a misogynistic book through and through. The church, who is female, is a slave to Jesus, and Christian women are slaves to Jesus, their husbands, and all men everywhere. That's what the Bible teaches anyway. Furthermore, this teaching carries over into the secular world to some extent. I know that despite the fact that the Bible says Christians are slaves to Jesus, they want to claim that they aren't his slaves. They're his friends and his brothers and sisters, they say. Well, Jesus was Yahweh's son, but that didn't keep him from having to do every little thing Yahweh said, did it? Jesus was obedient unto death, just as he tells Christians they must be obedient to him unto death. Anyway, a slave owner could claim the same thing regarding his slave. Children who grew up in families with slaves played with the slaves. Surely when they were grown, they didn't ignore the friendship completely. Plus, masters had sex with their slaves and bore children by them. These children were siblings to the master's children, born of their legitimate wives. But the slaves were still slaves, and later became slaves to the children they grew up with, some of whom may have been their half-brothers and sisters. And that's biologically, not just in some mystical or pretend way. Ask Ham about this. Because of his indiscretion with his father, Noah put a curse on Ham's son Canaan, so that Canaan would be a slave to Ham's brothers Shem and Japheth. Being the brother or sister of Jesus or anyone else doesn't keep a person from being the slave of the same brother. Christians are bought by Jesus to be his slaves and do his bidding without question. In several places, the Bible calls them his slaves. Yes, Galatians 4:7 says Christians are no more servants but sons, but does that change anything? Maybe this is just one of those not this but that constructions that don't deny the first thing at all, but simply put emphasis on the second behavior. For instance, women are told not to adorn themselves outwardly, but rather inwardly. Does that mean no jewelry or makeup or expensive clothes? Well, Christians tell us it doesn't mean that. They say it's simply placing emphasis on the most important aspect. And here's one we know can't be a prohibition. John 6:27 says not to work for meat that perishes, but for meat that endures unto everlasting life. Does that mean it's a sin to work? Of course not. Then there's this crazy verse. 1 Corinthians 10:24, let no man seek his own, but every man another's wealth. So I guess we can work for meat that perishes, but only to make money for other people to buy meat with. I think few people even try to follow the dictates of that command, no matter what it means. Romans 2:28-29 says a person is not a Jew outwardly, but then it goes on to say, but people are Jews inwardly. We know that Jews are also Jews outwardly. That's their lineage. Anyway, even if being a brother or sister precluded one from being a slave, the Bible still calls Christians slaves to Jesus. And as I sometimes say, it's not my job to fix biblical contradictions. I don't have to twist myself into a pretzel to make the Bible cohesive. I take it as it comes. Let the contradictions fall where they will. The church can never say no to Jesus. She can't question Jesus or his authority. Hers is not to question why. Hers is but to do or die. We know, of course, that the relationship of Jesus to the church is compared to the marriage between a man and a woman. And you know where I'm going with that. Women in the Bible were property of men, just as Christians are property of Jesus. Men purchased wives from the women's fathers. Maybe a man paid 200 foreskins for a wife. Maybe he worked 14 years for one, or rather two. Maybe he just went out and raped a girl and then paid her father off. Of course, she might have been a spoil of war along with the other animals. Just as Christians are slaves to Jesus, a woman is a slave to her husband. 1 Peter 2:18 says, servants, be subject to your masters with all fear. And in the same context, Peter wrote, 1 Peter 3:1, likewise, ye wives, be in subjection to your own husbands. Likewise. There's no difference there. Subjection is subjection. Whatever slaves were to be to their masters, wives were to be to their husbands. Remember wonderful Sarah, Abraham's wife? The New Testament does. And what does it say about her? Right here in the same passage, 5 verses down from the last verse I mentioned, it says, 1 Peter 3:6, even as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, whose daughters ye are as long as you do well and are not afraid with any amazement. Regarding slaves, Paul wrote, Colossians 3:22, servants, obey in all things your masters according to the flesh. He also wrote, 1 Corinthians 14:34, let your women keep silence in the churches, for it is not permitted unto them to speak, but they are commanded to be under obedience, as also saith the law. This wasn't even referring to marriage, of course. Women must be under obedience to all men in the church. But the obedience of a wife has generally been a part of marriage covenants, and sometimes still is today. The woman vows to be obedient to her husband. That's because it's what the Bible says to do. And preachers say somebody has to be in charge. Somebody has to be the final authority in a marriage. Luke 2:51 states that Jesus, once his parents found him in the temple when he failed to leave, when they headed out from Jerusalem, went home and was subject to them. What does that mean? It means he obeyed them, right? What else could it mean? Women are to subject themselves to the will of their husbands just like children do. Christians who don't like this can deny it till the cows come home, but that won't make it go away. Genesis 3:16 says it clearly. The husband is to rule over the wife. Unless a person follows preterism, that verse still stands. Plus, the man was formed first, so he has the preeminence. The Bible condones multiple wives for men. It isn't called adultery. Under the law of Moses, a man couldn't deprive the first wife when he took another. And a man couldn't marry his wife's sister since that would vex his wife. Not that Jacob followed that, of course, but since he married both Leah and Rachel. But that's in Genesis. And the prohibition is in Leviticus, so Jacob lived before Yahweh changed his mind about this. Under the law, if a woman had sex outside of marriage and got caught, she was stoned. And she had to have proof that she was a virgin upon marriage by showing the bloody sheet from her wedding night. We all know some women don't bleed the first time they have sex, but Yahweh apparently didn't know that, so some innocent women may have been murdered. What about men? What proof did they need regarding their virginity? None at all, of course. Nor were they killed for having sex before marriage unless they messed around with some other man's wife or fiancée. Oh, and if a man had sex with his own wife while she was having her period, both of them were cut off from among the people. That's because the man discovered his wife's fountain. I guess that's why a man needed multiple wives. Surely one of them wouldn't be on her period when he was needy. Speaking of bleeding, if a woman under the law had a male child, she was unclean for a week. But if she had a maid child, she was unclean for 2 weeks. Why? What's the scientific reason for that? There isn't one. In Leviticus 27, various items, humans, and other animals are being brought to the priest. The priest is placing a value on the land, houses, cattle, and humans. And we notice that the value of a female is less than the value of a male. I'll talk more about this chapter in another video. Back to the husband's rule over the wife. Let somebody say it. This is not just about roles. That's what Christians like to tell us. Oh, my husband and I are equal, but we just have different roles. Yeah, one of you is the master and the other is the master's slave. Your husband rules over you, but y'all are equal? In worthiness as a person, yes, so don't try to deflect with that. Harry is worth as much as William, too, but Harry will never get to be the King of England. Worthy as he might be, he will never rule. Christians say the same thing about the church hierarchy. Men and women are equal in the church, they declare, but they just have different roles. And the roles are equally important, they tell us. Okay, then. What if the Bible said all Canadians had to be subservient to all Mexicans? Would that be okay? Would Mexicans and Canadians just have different roles but be equal? Or hey, what if it said all men had to be subservient to all women in the church? Or all Gentiles had to be subservient to all Jews in the church? Would that fly? Or maybe it could be all short people have to be in subjection to all tall people. It doesn't matter what the categories are. It's all wrong. Setting one group of people over another group for no reason other than one is male and one is female is wrong. It's immoral. My goodness, why don't we know that is evil? And if a man's being ruler of his wife, or men in the church ruling the women, means all of these people are still equal, is that also true with the church and Jesus? Is the church equal to Jesus since she's his wife and they are one being? She's the body and he's the head? But they simply have different roles? Yeah, I didn't think so. The head is more important, isn't it? At least it has more authority and power. Think about your own body. Your head is prominent, right? You can chop off an arm or a leg. You can give up half your liver or a whole kidney. You can even replace some body parts with artificial man-made parts. But you're not going to live without your head. Ephesians 5:23 and 24 says, "For the husband is the head of the wife, even as Christ is the head of the church. Therefore, as the church is subject unto Christ, so let the wives be to their own husbands in everything." Doesn't get clearer than that. And it's appalling. The first time the first person heard the words in that passage, that person should have shaken their head and said, no, that's not from a good or right thinking God. But as a species, we are gullible. We're easily confused and easily led. And when the people who are stronger or have more intelligence or a higher position in life tell the people who are weaker and more vulnerable that it is what the powerful ones say it is, then it is what they say it is. It doesn't matter how evil the behavior might be. If those in power say it's okay, then the people at the bottom agree. And that's the only reason humans have ever said Yahweh is good. Come on, it's the only reason any sane person would say baby killing is fine and dandy. It's the only reason a sane person would say buying and selling humans and bequeathing them to your children is fine and dandy. It's the only reason it's fine and dandy for men to rule over women. And it's the only reason women today allow it. Because the man in power, Yahweh, said that's the way it is. But it sure doesn't make it right. And any sane person should know that. Well, truthfully, it's because men in power said there's a God in power, and he wants you women to kowtow to us. Yes, it was men who wrote the Bible. I keep saying Yahweh said this or did that. Yahweh didn't say or do diddly squat because Yahweh doesn't exist. Men, crazy, deluded, cruel, ignorant, and probably often stoned men wrote this crap. And when Christians tell us what the Bible says and try to force it on us, they're really attempting to make us obey the dictates of ancient men who didn't know as much as we do. The Christians themselves are worshiping these old men and obeying their words despite knowing that these men commanded atrocious behaviors. But back to these ancient women. During the time when they lived and these horrible misogynistic words were spoken, the women, pregnant or nursing most of the time and needing somebody to provide for them and their children, said, "Yes, Master," or "Yes, Lord," but again, that doesn't make it right. The other night, I was remembering what it was like to walk into a church building, knowing that all the men from 8 years old or whatever age the youngest Christian baby boy was, were my superiors, and I had to be in subjection to them all, including the 8-year-old boy. And I didn't think anything at all about it at the time. It felt perfectly normal to me. Why? Why in the world would that feel normal or okay? Well, I know why, and so do you. That's what had been normal for me from childhood. I didn't know anything different. I was told it was right and proper, and I believed what I was told. And honestly, it didn't matter whether it was right and proper. Yahweh said it, and that settled it. But now, today, if I put myself and my family in that situation, it would feel absolutely unacceptable and deplorable. And no, I'm not thinking about myself here. I'm not being arrogant or a rebel. Sure, I'm included, but I'm not mainly concerned about myself. When I think and about, and imagine that scene again, what I think is that I would not take my little girls nor my little boys into a place like that again. Love for my children and common decency require me today to feel this way. I would not ever again subject my babies to that immorality. Not in a million years. I wouldn't teach my children or allow them to be taught that the boys are in charge and the girls just have to go along with whatever. It deeply saddens me that I did just that to my children. Let me ask you women something. Would you work at a place where all the men there had authority over you, from the janitor to the CEO, simply because they were men? Would you join a club where that was the situation? Would you take your children into a school like that? Would you put your little girls on a soccer team or a t-ball team if they had to submit to the decisions of the little boys? Would you even allow them to go to a birthday party where the boys ruled? You wouldn't do any of this. You're not that stupid or wicked. But if you, as I once did, take your girls and boys into a building used for religious purposes and you allow the same discrimination at the hands of your boys against your girls, or men and little boys against all the women and girls, then you are blind. And you might as well let it happen other places too. In fact, it's worse in a marriage or religion or even a country, because those are always ongoing and authoritative, and two of these are intimate relationships. They therefore do more damage to girls and women than a game or a party would. Women and girls have suffered in abusive relationships with men for centuries. Did you know that it wasn't until 1920 that women won the right to vote in the United States? 1920. This was during the lifetime of my parents. They were babies, but still. Employers didn't have to pay women equally for the same job a man did until 1963. That was in my lifetime. I was 11 years old. Women couldn't get credit cards in their name until 1974. That's the year I graduated from college. I was 22 years old before I could have a credit card in my name. That was plenty young enough for me, but not for women older than I was. Women couldn't serve on a jury in all 50 states until 1975. It was 1977 before Harvard started accepting sex-blind admissions. It was 1978 before a woman couldn't be refused a job if she was pregnant or couldn't be fired from her job for the same reason. It wasn't until 1980 that sexual harassment was considered a form of sex discrimination. Marital rape wasn't illegal in all 50 states until 1993, and now we're a little into my children's lifetime. We women are still waging this war against misogyny, and we all know why. The Bible. And it's not the book for me, or for any woman with a shred of self-respect and clear-sightedness, nor for any decent man who cares about the welfare of his wife and daughters and other women in the world, or even if he himself simply doesn't want to be a slave bride to Jesus. Thank you all. Bye.